There was a time when autonomous ride hailing sounded like a science project, something you'd see in a demo video, not on a real street with real people trusting it with their lives. Back then, the hardest part wasn't the technology, it was belief. People asked if it was safe, if it was practical, if it would ever scale beyond a few carefully mapped roads. Fair questions. Progress always sounds unrealistic right before it becomes obvious. What changed wasn't one breakthrough, but thousands of small, unglamorous ones stacked on top of each other. Better sensors, better data, better neural networks learning from millions of real-world situations. Every mile driven taught the system something new. Every edge case made it smarter, and quietly, without fanfare, the idea crossed a threshold from interesting to inevitable. Now, you don't have to imagine it, you see it on city streets, in neighborhoods, at airports, at night, in the rain, during rush hour. What was once a prototype has become infrastructure, not because people were forced into it, but because it worked consistently, predictably, and at scale. This is how real change happens. Not with a single dramatic moment, but with a slow shift in expectations. First it's novel, then it's normal, then you can't remember how things worked before it existed. That's the point where a concept stops being a product and starts becoming part of everyday life. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back, because the future doesn't arrive all at once. It shows up everywhere, one ride at a time. Once something becomes everywhere, it doesn't just change behavior, it reshapes the environment around it. Cities weren't designed for autonomy. They were designed for human drivers, parking lots, traffic lights, mistakes, and for decades we accepted congestion, noise, wasted time, and polluted air as the price of mobility. But that was never a law of nature. It was just a limitation of the tools we were using. When autonomous ride hailing enters the picture at scale, cities start to behave differently. Traffic flows more smoothly because vehicles don't get distracted, angry, or tired. Intersections become safer because coordination replaces guesswork. The need for endless parking shrinks, freeing up space for parks, housing, and places where people actually want to spend time. Streets stop being just corridors for cars and start becoming shared spaces again. What's powerful here isn't just efficiency, it's optionality. You no longer plan your life around traffic or parking, you plan it around time. Commutes become moments to think, work, or just breathe. Mobility stops being a source of stress and starts becoming a background utility, like electricity or the internet, always there, quietly reliable. And this doesn't only affect big cities. Smaller towns gain access to smarter transportation without massive infrastructure projects. Elderly people regain independence. Kids get safer rides. Entire communities become more connected without adding more asphalt or emissions. This is what happens when you stop optimizing for cars and start optimizing for people. Urban mobility shifts from ownership to access, from chaos to coordination, from friction to flow. And once cities taste that level of calm and efficiency, they won't ever choose to go back. At the center of all of this is a quiet shift in trust. For over 100 years, transportation has depended on human judgment, our reflexes, our moods, our attention span. And most of the time, that worked. But most of the time is also where accidents live. Fatigue, distraction, impatience. Those aren't rare bugs in human driving, they're features of being human. What changes when AI takes the wheel isn't just who's driving, but how driving itself works. An autonomous system doesn't get bored at a red light. It doesn't text. It doesn't rush to beat traffic. It sees in all directions at once, processes more data than any person could, and makes decisions in milliseconds. And unlike a human, it gets better every single mile it drives, learning collectively, not individually. This isn't about removing people from the equation, it's about removing unnecessary risk. Humans still decide the goals, the values, the constraints. The system simply executes them with consistency. Over time, safety stops being a personal skill and becomes a shared property of the network. One improvement benefits everyone, everywhere, and that has a subtle psychological effect. When you're not gripping a steering wheel, your mind relaxes. You look up, you think differently. You arrive less exhausted than when you left. The machine handles the complexity so the human can focus on being human. Trust doesn't appear overnight. It's earned through repetition, transparency, and performance. Ride after ride, intersection after intersection, that trust builds quietly until one day you realize you no longer think about it at all. That's when technology disappears into the background. And when that happens, freedom quietly takes the driver's seat. For most of modern history, owning a car wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Freedom meant keys in your pocket, a driveway, a parking spot you defended like territory. But symbols change when reality changes. Once transportation becomes reliable, autonomous, and available on demand, ownership stops being the default and starts becoming a choice. When you don't have to drive, maintain, insure, or park a vehicle, the question shifts from what do I own to what do I need right now? A ride shows up when you want it, leaves when you're done, and costs less than carrying a machine that sits idle most of the day. Time replaces possession. Access replaces attachment. This isn't about taking anything away, it's about removing friction. No oil changes, no surprise repairs, no circling the block for parking. Mobility becomes elastic, scaling with your life instead of anchoring you to it. Some days you need a quick solo ride. Other days you need space, quiet, or room for people. The system adapts instantly. What's interesting is how quickly behavior changes once convenience crosses a certain threshold. People don't miss ownership when reliability is absolute. They don't romanticize the steering wheel when the alternative gives them back hours a week. The emotional bond shifts from a machine you own to a service you trust. And this has ripple effects. If fewer privately owned cars means fewer vehicles overall, less congestion, less waste. Cities breathe easier, resources are used more intelligently. The entire system becomes leaner, calmer, more efficient. Ownership made sense when it was the only option. But once access becomes effortless, freedom stops needing a title. Whenever a system changes at scale, it sends shockwaves far beyond its original purpose. Autonomous ride-hailing isn't just about moving people, it reshapes economics, energy use, and how society allocate resources. And that's where the impact becomes impossible to ignore. Start with efficiency. A single shared autonomous vehicle can replace multiple privately owned cars simply because it's used more often. That means fewer vehicles need to be manufactured, fewer raw materials are extracted, and less energy is wasted producing machines that sit idle most of their lives. The math is simple, but the implications are huge. Then there's energy. When transportation shifts toward electric, autonomous fleets' emissions don't just decrease, they become predictable and optimizable. Vehicles charge when the grid is cleanest. Roads are chosen for efficiency, not impatience. Traffic jams, those massive engines of wasted fuel, begin to dissolve. The city starts consuming energy intelligently instead of impulsively. Economically, new opportunities emerge as old assumptions fade. Yes, some jobs change. That's always true when productivity jumps. But entirely new ecosystems form around fleet management, AI training, infrastructure, and services built on top of reliable, low-cost mobility. History shows this pattern again and again. Automation doesn't erase value, it relocates it. And perhaps most importantly, access expands. Transportation becomes cheaper and more consistent, opening doors for people who were previously limited by cost, distance, or ability. When mobility improves, opportunity follows. Education, healthcare, and work all become more reachable. This isn't disruption for its own sake. It's optimization at a civilizational level, doing more with less, cleaner, smarter, and fairer. And once a society sees that kind of efficiency, waste stops being acceptable. What you're seeing now isn't the finish line, it's the opening move. Autonomous ride-hailing is just one layer of a much larger transformation. Once vehicles can move themselves reliably, they stop being isolated products and start becoming nodes in a connected system. Transportation blends into logistics, energy, communications, and AI in ways that compound. Not imagine a world where vehicles don't just move people, but coordinate with the power grid, traffic systems, and city infrastructure in real time. Where routes adapt instantly to weather, demand, and emergencies. Where mobility becomes a platform others build on, new services, new business models, new ways of living that don't exist yet because the foundation wasn't stable enough before. This is how exponential change works. The first version looks impressive. The second feels useful. The third becomes invisible. And then suddenly everything else reorganizes around it. We've seen this with electricity, with the internet, with smartphones. Autonomous mobility follows the same curve, just faster, because now the system itself can learn and iterate. What matters most is mindset. The biggest mistake is assuming today's version defines tomorrow's limits. It doesn't. It barely hints at them. Once a technology proves it can work safely at scale, innovation accelerates not in straight lines, but in bursts. Capabilities stack. Costs fall. Adoption spreads sideways into places you didn't predict. And here's the part people often miss. This isn't about replacing the present. It's about unlocking futures that were impossible under old constraints. Less friction creates more room for creativity, connection, and progress. So when you see this everywhere, don't ask how far it's come. Ask how far it's about to go.